Well, good morning. It's good to see all of you here. Good to have you joining us online on our website or on Facebook Live. Glad that you are here with us. Though it's Pentecost Sunday, we would normally maybe take a Sunday off of what we were doing to just talk about the kind of church calendar celebration. But I thought we would continue on with the book study we began last weekend. And so if you have a Bible, let me encourage you to open up with me to Colossians chapter 1. Colossians 1, as we continue through this short letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Colossae. We will be reading this morning a short little passage, just a few verses, but as you'll see, it's kind of jam-packed, filled with truth and profound beauty and wisdom, and frankly, some claims that might be difficult for us to believe, yet hold within them the promise of profound gratitude and new life if we can claim hold to them and believe them. Before we get to the text, though, a story. As many of you know, I've had 3 seizures in my lifetime, all over the past 6 years or so. And I don't know if you've had a seizure or not. I hope many of you have not. My seizures are grand mal seizures, and so I lose consciousness. My whole body kind of jerks. And I don't really remember much of what happens. I'm not really aware of it coming on, and so there's not really like a warning sign for me. And all 3 times it's happened, it's kind of been a pretty similar experience, which is kind of out of the blue. I wake up and I'm just disoriented. I don't know where I am. I don't know if I'm safe. I don't know what's happened. And I have to start piecing the kind of puzzle pieces back together again. The very first time it happened to me was at a Rockets game. And I gave everyone in our row a good story to tell, because you're kind of jam-packed in that stadium, right? This is pre-pandemic days, and you're, how can I say this in church? Waist to waist, right? With whoever you're there with and or your strangers around you. And I lost consciousness, and my body starts jerking, and I wake up in the ambulance, really kind of come to in the hospital, and then told later, I was dating my wife, now wife Lindsay at the time, that as the paramedics were getting me out of the stadium and into the ambulance, I kept saying, "Don't trust that woman, don't let her in the ambulance with me." Putting her in the very awkward position of be like, I'm dating this man child. I don't know what's wrong with his brain. There's obviously things y'all can see. Things aren't going right now. But please let me get in the ambulance and come to the hospital with him. I didn't know what was safe, right? I didn't know what was going on. The second time that I woke up after having a seizure, I was in a car and it was crashed and totaled. And there's blood everywhere. And again, paramedics and firefighters and I'm immediately, again, trying to piece together. I'm told that on both of these occasions, I actually punched the first paramedic that I saw, which is not like Mike type activity, right? I'm more like a slap and run or just like a passive-aggressive insult. Seizure Mike, though, is like, get out of the way, okay? Apparently, it's not too uncommon of a thing, right? Though you wake up and you're scared. You don't know what's happening. You don't know who's in front of you. All you know is that this is not what you were expecting to be facing in reality. The very last time it happened was a little over 2 years ago. So this is the longest I've gone without a seizure in a bit. And so we'll knock on wood there. But I was up here at the church all by myself and very on brand for those of you who know me. I'd kind of taken a break from working and I was up in the sanctuary and I was playing around on the drums. And I woke up on the floor and there's some blood around and I was kind of had this big scratch on my forehead, and I was like, okay, I guess I fell down, and then my muscles started feeling like I'd run a marathon, from all of the like convulsions that happen while one has a seizure, and at some point or another, I texted Lindsay like, hey, I need someone to come pick me up, and it took me probably 2 or 3 hours with no one else around to finally figure out like, oh, I think I had a seizure. I think that's what happened. I had another seizure. One of the most discomforting parts of having a seizure to me is not just that I'm unable to know when exactly perfectly it's coming or not coming, but is that sense of dislocation afterwards. Where am I? And what has happened to me? And that sense of disorientation. All these questions that you have to have and all these puzzle pieces you have to put back together. And then, it just continues, right? What caused this seizure? How are we going to fix this and treat this? What is the future of my life going to look like? I mentioned my experience with seizures because in a lot of ways, I feel like our world right now, particularly our immediate culture and society that we kind of belong to, is in a place of severe dislocation and disorientation, where we have a lot of questions about what has happened and where we are, and who we should trust and who we shouldn't trust, who we should let on the ambulance with us and who we shouldn't let on the ambulance with us, what's safe and what isn't safe. I think the kind of late stage pandemic era that we're in right now is one of profound dislocation and disorientation. And whether you've experienced this or not, I'm betting you know someone, a good friend or family member, who has experienced this in a kind of profound way and is left now dealing with questions they don't have great answers to. Questions like, who do I trust? Who do I listen to? What's the future going to look like? What's safe? What's safe to do, to experience, to be around? Who should I follow and trust? These are questions, I think, that have been building in our culture and society, and questions that all humans at some level have wrestled with as long as we've been around. But I think certainly as we're slowly but surely kind of exiting out of the immediate emergency pandemic here in our nation, many of us are stuck wrestling with these questions. Now, our text this morning in Colossians is going to attempt to give us a comprehensive answer to these and all other important questions in life. It's going to try to give you the center of all of reality, a truth that is true for every human being at every time throughout history in every situation, something that you can hold dear as kind of the center of reality, something that you can use to interpret all of your other experiences. A story so true and so cosmic in scope that it spreads light, illuminates all the other stories of your life and our world, our families, and our individual stories. So let's read together. It's maybe the most famous passage here in Colossians. Sometimes it's called the Christ hymn, verses 15 through verse 20. If you remember, just in context from the beginning of our sermon series, Paul is just giving thanks for the Colossian church to the Father, and he's talked about how Christians are called to live in thanksgiving, and this, I think, is one of the ways he expands on why Christians live lives of gratitude. It's because of some of the truths he's going to lay out about the person and work of Christ. But if you'll read with me here. And as we read, let me ask you to do a couple things. Notice every time this Greek word, panta, it's one word in Greek, it's two words in English, all things is used in this passage. And then notice prepositions, again and through and for, okay? It goes like this. The Son, that is Jesus of Nazareth, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Now, I want to remind you that this letter is written just a decade or 2 decades. 3 would be really stretching it after the life of Jesus. And so this is a pretty remarkable thing for people to start saying about a man who people are still alive who lived with him. Just notice all the exalted language here, right? This hymn is a hymn of praise. It's really poetry. It's not set out in most of our English Bibles that way. But it's all about the supremacy and centrality, the beauty and the power, the lordship of this person and what he's accomplished through his life and death and resurrection. All things over and over and over again. Verse 16, in him all things were created. What exists? What has ever been created that Paul now says did not happen because of Jesus, with Jesus as the creator? Nothing. According to Paul, this is a completely comprehensive statement. Everything that has ever existed and ever will exist exists because Jesus has created it. This is a remarkable thing to say about someone. Every galaxy, every grain of sand and blade of grass, every human being, everything that exists, every virus and bacteria and fungi, every culture, every nation, things visible and invisible, all of them created by Jesus the Christ. He's before all things. How many things does Jesus have second place in, according to Paul? None. There's no aspect of life in which Jesus comes in second, in which he does not have rank and priority, in which he does not have lordship and the right to reign. In him, again, Panta, all things hold together. He's the head of the body, the firstborn from among the dead. Again, what's been reconciled? How many things have been reconciled on earth and in heaven through the peace he made on the cross? Paul says, Panta, all things. The same Christ who created all things and has held them all together has now returned them back to where they were supposed to be at the beginning. This is about as comprehensive of a truth claim as one can make. For the Apostle Paul here, it's Jesus of Nazareth, not just this concept of Jesus, but the actual person and work of Jesus, who stands at the center of all of history, who stands at the center of all of reality, who is the one capital T truth that we can compare and interpret and understand all other experiences and truths in light of. All things over and over and over again. And then three prepositions I think we find in this passage that help illuminate what's going on here. In verse 16, in him all things were created. And then later on in verse 16, through him and for him. In, through, and for. I think this gives us a sense of the cosmic comprehensive scope here of what Paul's saying about Jesus. The one who's created and now recreating all things. Everything came in him, through him, and then, very interesting enough, for him. All things that were created for him. He's the goal or the end or the telos. He's the reason things existed. He's the reason things happen. The one who created the world has not left the world to itself, but instead continues to hold things together. And even as things fall apart, as they do, he returns them and brings them back in reconciliation. Last week I said as we read through the book of Colossians, we should do so always with an eye out towards what Old Testament allusions might there be in the passage, and also what imperial echoes or allusions might there be. This is an apostle who's writing in prison because of the Roman Empire and to a church that is a small, dislocated community present in the midst of a much larger, overarching, totalitizing empire. Just two examples, although we could go through the whole passage with both of these kind of hermeneutical or interpretive tests here. The image of the invisible God. That might remind you of Genesis 1. In fact, most of this passage perhaps might remind you of Genesis 1. Talk about creation, talk about the beginning, talking about the image of the invisible God. In Genesis 1, humankind were created to be the image bearers of God. But what the New Testament will say over and over and over again is that Jesus now has come, the God-man, God incarnate in flesh, and he has come as the fullest revelation of the character and nature of God. the most complete and perfect picture of what God is like. And so as we look back on this Genesis text, Christian theologians have gone, when God says in Genesis, let us make man after our own image, the image we were being created after was this image, the eternal Son of God, the one who created and holds all things together, the one for whom all things were created. He not only shows us perfectly who God is, but he shows us now what humanity was always supposed to be like, what a truly human life looks like, flourishing in God's kingdom, and a perfect relationship with the Father, guided by the Spirit without burden or hesitation. This is quite the claim to make, yet scriptures do it repeatedly. Jesus himself does this. The book of Hebrews will say this as well. In times of past, at the very beginning of the book of Hebrews, through various messengers and prophets, God has sent us messages, but now in these last days, we've gotten his Son, who's the exact representation, the perfect imprint of what God is like. For so many of us, our image of God is really actually just things we've always assumed about God, maybe from philosophy or culture, or it's a composite image of God. So we take different puzzle pieces from different places, like maybe things we heard growing up or things that feel intuitively true to us, or maybe a collection of different Bible stories that we think hold more weight than other ones. Jesus, the scriptures, though, are going to constantly say that every other picture of God is imperfect. That if you really want to know what God is like, if you really want to know what God's up to, what his character and nature is, what his opinions are, look at the Gospels. He came close to us. He spoke to us. He touched and healed us. Jesus is the image of the invisible God. One example of an Old Testament illusion, and then one example of an imperial illusion here would be this peace in verse 20. You might remember one of the most broad claims the Roman Empire made was to have brought peace to the known world, Pax Romana. But the way that they brought peace to the world was highly contingent on what side of the empire you were on. And it was a violent, crucifying type of peace. The peace that Jesus makes here, though, is a self-giving love type of peace. It's peace made not through shedding blood, but by having one's blood shed. And it's peace that doesn't just reconcile subservient communities and nations who will pay the taxes and won't revolt. It's a peace that reconciles all things, that holds all things together, brings all things back to the source of life. In fact, again, just like with the Old Testament, almost every line in this one passage would have been a slap in the face to the Roman emperor, to the empire, who claimed to be the firstborn over creation. I mean, you don't think that they would have understood what Paul is saying here when he says, by the way, he's over all things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. And let me put some parentheses here. I don't care what throne it is. I don't care what power it is. I don't care what ruler it is. I don't care what authority it is. Jesus is ahead of it, which is, again, quite the astonishing claim to make, particularly at this time for the Apostle Paul, who is in prison, not the most successful of situations, to a small fledgling church community, likely to see persecution coming down the turnpike. It would be a lot easier for us to say and imagine that Jesus is ahead of and before and supreme over all thrones and dominions and rulers and authorities. Because for better or worse, Christianity has kind of been able to navigate the political powers of the last 1,000, 1,500 years in such a way that we've largely remained in control. Think about making claims like this from a prison cell to a small group of Christians meeting in a house in the midst of a much larger empire around them. But Paul tells us it's by looking at Jesus that we see who God is. It's Jesus himself who holds together creation and new creation. This is a remarkable thing to say. The poet William Butler Yeats, in his poem The Second Coming, said, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold." something that's so true about almost everything in our world. Things just fall apart. Sometimes they fly apart. A sinner very rarely holds. Yet according to this poem, according to this passage, Jesus is the one who holds all things together. He's the sinner that holds. Pastor Brian Zahn, just a couple of weeks ago, was preaching on this passage, and he mentioned that death itself is the roughest aspect of falling apart. One day all of us are headed towards this reality where our bodies will start to decay and then decompose. The center of our mortal life can't hold. But what if Paul is right? What if this is true? What if there's an ascended, eternal, living, and reigning King, Jesus, who holds all things together? And what if when no one else in the world remembers you, because I don't know how long you'll think you'll be remembered, but I would guess like not past 4 or 5 generations. And you could go back through your own family if you wanted to test this hypothesis. But like pretty quickly, no one will care about you. But Pastor John reminded me and his congregation that when everyone else forgets about you, guess who remembers you? Jesus. And when Jesus remembers you, that also means he can remember you. He can pull you back together. He can bring you back in resurrection to enjoy this new life he's organizing and leading history towards as the firstborn of the dead. He holds all things together. And because of that, he's the blueprint for genuine humanness, the kind of life that's on offer through the gospel. Even in this very cosmic, comprehensive hymn of praise, we still get the church mentioned here. He's also the head of the body, the church. This ragtag group of humans that meet together to eat and drink and to sing and to open up the scriptures, to remember and worship and encourage one another, to follow Jesus and endure in good works. The church is, in a sense, the first fruit, the firstborn of this renewed humanity that Jesus has come to create, being renewed in the image of God. And so we come back to the questions that we began our sermon with. Is there someone that we can trust? What do we do when we don't know where we're going or what the future holds? What do we do when we don't necessarily know what's safe or what isn't safe or who we can or can't listen to? Might there be a capital T truth that we can hold on to? Might there be one story, one person that can comprehensively claim to be the center of all of reality, no matter where we are in history, no matter what's happening in the world around us, no matter what is happening in our individual lives? Paul here, I think, would obviously say yes. It's the person and work of Jesus, but for some very understandable reasons, this can be hard for us to accept. As humans who struggle, and even as just modern and postmodern people. So we live in a period of time, philosophically and culturally, called postmodernity. Have you heard of that phrase, postmodernity, postmodernism? And some philosophers describe postmodernity as a distrust in meta-narratives. So a meta-narrative is a story that claims to be true across all time periods and across all experiences. It's like a master story, like a grand story. It's a story of empires, right? And for some very, very good reasons, you and I as people, and we're all postmodern people, whether you realize it or not, have learned to distrust people who claim to know the entire truth, who have the one story that makes sense of all the other stories. We live in a fake news era. Again, this doesn't just come out of anywhere. Right? I mean, this boils up out of the philosophy, culture, experience of humanity that we find ourselves in at this place and time in world history. Where the meta-narrative of science and progress fell apart in the first 2 world wars, and the Spanish flu. in the early 1900s, where that story fell apart and where people then started asking questions like, well, why do people make claims like that to begin with? What's in it for them? And most of the time, when someone claims to have a master story, a meta-narrative, it is being used to legitimize an individual or an enterprise or a society or a nation. It's being used to underwrite self-interest. It can be very oppressive and triumphalist. It can totalitize. It can erase differences. And so in the postmodern world, you and I have come to be very cautious about anyone who claims to have a capital T truth. Because I don't know if your truth really fits into my lived experience. And I don't know who's paying you to tell that truth. Right? Again, think of the questions that we ask, the distrust in authority that we have. Again, I'm not saying it's wrong for us to have these questions. I think they're understandable. Some Christians have thought that postmodernity is like a cuss word and like the worst thing that could possibly happen to Christianity. A theologian, N.T. Wright, says postmodernity is really just preaching the fall to modernity, to the cultural phase that came before it, which was this kind of arrogance in human progress and reason. And postmodernity comes along and says, by the way, you can be as smart as you want, but you're still broken. And so you can cure certain diseases, but you can also create atomic bombs. And you can get rid of certain diseases, but you can't muster up the goodwill to give that to other nations for free, while their children suffer needlessly because of these conditions and sicknesses and illnesses. And so we're distrustful. Who's saying that? Why are they saying that? What interest does this serve? And the question, I think, for us is, could we even possibly accept such comprehensive claims in the world that we live in, that Paul makes here? These meta-narrative claims, these total truth claims. I think the story of the gospel is in one sense definitely a meta-narrative, but it's unlike other meta-narratives, unlike other master stories that we've learned to distrust. You know, there are two dimensions of the biblical story that kind of delegitimize and subvert violent and totalitizing uses of stories. One, there's this consistent and radical sensitivity that pervades the entire narrative towards those who suffer. Even the story of Jesus, right, is not about one who makes others suffer, but one who suffers. And then two, rooted in God's creational intent and the cosmic scope of God's work and intentions, that comes with it preloaded a bias against anyone narrowing it for partisan use, commercializing it for their own opportunities. If we were going to ask the question, what's the closest thing to the Roman Empire around us today, to try to apply some of these things into our life, we might say it's like global consumerism. I mean, those are the images that are around us all the time, just like the images of Caesar would have been on all the coins and propaganda throughout the empire. We have images of multinational corporations and how we've been discipled in our world to understand who we are and how we can express ourselves. It's by consuming. Think about how passionate people get about boycotting a company or belonging to this kind of tribe in terms of things we buy and own and enjoy, versus this type of tribe in terms of things we buy and own and enjoy. In many ways, this is kind of how global capitalism has created a theory of humanity. What are humans if they're consumers? How do you create your life? Well, you choose what you will or won't consume. And you spend most of your life trying to work up enough capital to consume as much as possible. You know what's very interesting to me, and it didn't really hit me until this week. I don't know why I've never quite thought of this. Jesus never sells anything. Think about this. Jesus comes, and Paul after him saying, capital T truth, and they've got nothing to sell, which is just very interesting. It would not happen, I think, in our world. I see someone getting popular, getting YouTube views or fans or followers, and it's like a countdown, right, until like the GoFundMe or the Patreon, right? And again, this is not necessarily a bad thing, but until the kind of the crowdsource and fundraising. Or I see a company coming up and being built and having these amazing incentives and products, and the questions I ask is, well, how's the profit being made? If it's free to me, right, how am I being used here? Something's being sold, and if I'm not buying it, maybe I'm the one being sold. Jesus, though, in his ministry in Galilee, never has an infomercial. He's got nothing to sell. Now, the church has not done this very well all the time, because the church does try to take Jesus and sell him. The church does try to take the story of Jesus and harness it for our own purposes, our own power, our own gain. And unfortunately, at times throughout the world has done a decent job at this and put a blemish on the bride of Christ. But there's something about the cosmic story, the comprehensive reality, the truth of Jesus that continually breaks out of all efforts to contain and to box in, to harness towards our own intentions and our own goals. This is why many of us sometimes have to go into these periods where we have to do this hard work of deconstructing our faith, where we start to realize, like, okay, maybe a lot of the things that we were taught about Jesus or about the Bible or about the Christian faith actually was in service towards this power or this group or this cultural enterprise or understanding. And so we've got to try to tear down those walls while getting bigger and more glorious and more beautiful glimpses of the Christ who created all things and holds all things together and is reconciling all things to the peace shed on the cross. In a disoriented world, in a dislocated time, what if it is the person and work of Jesus that gives us the truth, that allows us to know all other truths, that gives us the story that can explain all other stories? What if the person and work of Christ is the center of all of reality, of all of history, and everything that might happen in our lives, in our society, in our world, in our families, it can all be trusted in the hands of the crucified and risen one. And our job is not to try to find these answers on our own, but to continually take our questions and continually take our seeking back to the source of all life. I said earlier, Jesus never sells anything. He's simply always and forever offering the gift of life, of full life, of true life, of eternal life, of flourishing life. One of the things that make meta-narratives scary at times is that the people who tell them then try to bring about the end result that's promised in that narrative. And this is one of the areas where Christians, I think, have gotten off track many times throughout history. So we say, okay, Jesus is reconciling all things, and we'll help him because I'll build this army right here, and I'll go kill all the unrighteous people, and we'll get to this promised end a lot faster. Many theologians have observed the only people with Messiah complexes in the Christian community are often these misplaced followers of Jesus. It wasn't Jesus himself who had the Messiah complex. Sometimes it's just his followers. Now, instead, the story of Jesus always lays out for us very beautifully that we're not the ones who bring this to fruition. While we anticipate the future beauty of salvation and full new creation, this is always and forever the work of Jesus and the Spirit in the world. Our task is not to manipulate its coming to be somehow, but simply to receive that news with gratefulness and to bear witness to it with the way we live our lives, the way we treat one another in the communities that we form. Christians, in this sense, are given space and time to relax and to breathe, to not feel the pressure of the weight of the world on our shoulders, the future of the world on our shoulders, because the sinner doesn't hold with Mike Skinner, and the sinner doesn't hold with our church, and the sinner doesn't hold with the church. The sinner holds with Jesus. And so we bear witness. We seek to be re-imaged in the one in whose image we were made. We seek to belong to this church who follows the self-giving Lord, who's made peace through his blood. Might we this morning receive with gratitude in our hearts the story and truth of Jesus as the center of all of reality, and might we learn how to experience every other story of our world and our lives in the shadow of this illuminating story. This story and this person, his narrative that casts light upon every other experience and story and question. Might we, like Paul, praise and give thanks for the one in whom all things are being made new.